Hi, this is Kazy Hinds, your mayor, and in today's episode of Eye on the City, we are at beautiful Johnston Farm and Indian Agency, and we have Andy Hite, the site director, with us, and we're going to do a little bit of just wandering and talking about the history of this place, how it is important to who we are as a community here in Piqua, and how it's important to the whole state of Ohio and the history that is out here.
It is. A lot of people don't realize the impact that this place had and this fella had on, our local history, state history, even American history. People don't realize that. I know when I taught American history, you never heard about John Johnston. So we're trying to change that.
That's great. That's great. Well, and I also think about the fact that for many years ago, we were kind of the beginning of the Wild West, if you will.
This was. People don't think about that either, because when Johnston lived here, this was the American frontier. If you went further west, America wasn't there yet, so this really was the edge of the country for a few years. The frontier line in here was very fleeting, but it was the edge of America.
Well, and we were known as the border city at one time.
And there's reason for that because of that, and also we're just below the Greenville Treaty Line, which was the demarcation between the native population and us. So we were the border city. People don't realize that either.
Wow, just this place is rich in history, and I am really excited to take our viewers here today to give you an idea about all the history that's out here and to have Andy share the wealth of information that he has, not only about this place, but just the history of our community as well. So why don't you join us as we walk into the farmhouse. Well, one of the things as we walk in, one of the first things that caught my eye, because as we walk into our homes, one of the first things we do is flip the switch for the electricity. And obviously back in the day,
when Johnston built this house, there wasn't any electricity. But people look at that today and they say, this is really primitive. But take this back to 1815 when they moved into the house. This was top drawer.
Oh, well, it's beautiful. I mean, it really is, thinking about, what, 18...
they began building the house 1811, 1812 era. During the War of 1812, things took some time, so they moved into the property in August of 1815. Up to that time, they lived in a two-story log cabin.
Okay. Wow. Wow. Well, why don't you show us a little bit around and tell us a little bit about some of the...
Well, we kind of got a collection of pictures here through the years. Obviously, the picture there in the middle is from the last summer, right after it was repainted, and then we have a collection of pictures of what the home looked like before it was purchased by the state of Ohio. And actually, most of these pictures go back into the late 1890s, early 1900s, and you can see, it was starting to deteriorate. And we were fortunate that we were able to save it and got to the place where we are now. The Johnston family moved out of this property in the 1870s. They sold it, went through a progression of owners. It was a tenant property at one time. In fact, if you go downtown and talk to Gary Anderson, Apple Tree Gallery, Gary was his family was the last people to live here. So Gary actually lived in this house.
Which I think is a great piece of Piqua history, because many people may not even realize that.
Oh no, people don't think about that. And Gary, you can get Gary talking, and he's got all kinds of stories about growing up here.
Oh, so I bet.
That's been a neat resource. And the other person I got to know besides Gary and his dad was a great resource, was John Carpenter, who used to be a contractor in town. And John was the one that did, we had to thank for this. He's the one that did the work. And John and I spent a lot of time together going through old pictures. So, in my 20-some years here, I've learned a lot about the house from the people that lived in the house and worked on the house. So we're very fortunate, but it's neat to see the different progressions of the house through the years. And one of the things that we want to do, and I won't belabor it, but there's some things in the interior here that we want to redo, that research has told us what it should look like. And as impressive as this is, when we get done, people are really going to be, oh my goodness, because this was a high federal style house. And that was what Johnston was used to in Philadelphia. He was used to that style of architecture. So he built that out here. So there's lots of, this house has seen a lot of history, and it's always fun to share the stories of this place.
Well, and it's so interesting because I know I went to the session that we had with the architect talking about, what you find as you take things down and you look at the walls of where there were chair rails and different things like that, which you can do as you kind of let the house kind of tell its own story.
Exactly, that's what we did, because it was purchased by the state of Ohio in 1965. In '68, they started the renovations, and they took it back to the bare brick walls, took the floors out, because the floorboards, these are not original floors, the floors were getting in pretty bad shape. So you could look through this whole house, top to bottom, and it really did tell a lot of its own story. And it's still telling a story today with some of the things that we've been able to do with the woodwork that's been retained and things like that. They've been able to do some studies that they couldn't do in '68 because of technology.
Wow.
Now we've got a lot better handle on what this place really looked like. Today, this would be the living room, or the fancy living room, the room that Mom would say, "I just cleaned the room, stay out of it."
This is where when people come to visit.
This is the drawing room. Kids said, "Well, drawing? No, this." Drawing means they withdrew from here after dinner. So this would have been where the important visitors would have come. Anybody came through Western Ohio, they stopped at Johnston's home. Fortunately, we have a great portrait of John himself. This was painted on the East Coast. He was in his early 40s in that picture. And so we get a good look at John Johnston, in his prime. And he was quite a fellow. When you start to tell the story of John Johnston, there's so many different layers to his life that it's really remarkable, the things that he did. When I came here, and the only thing people recognize his role as an Indian agent, but they didn't recognize his role in education. They didn't recognize his role in agriculture, politics as a whole. So he was a sort of a Renaissance man. He had his fingers in a little bit of everything, and really up until the time he passed away, he was the guy that people came to if they lived out this way, if they wanted to get something done. He was the go-to guy. And
he was connected, I think I read Kenyon University?
John was an Episcopal, and which is strange because he's Scot-Irish. He should have been Presbyterian. Had to get that in.
Yep.
Somehow he was Episcopal, very active. And he was a founding trustee for Kenyon College, and that was at that time when it was founded, it was an Episcopal seminary. And he was also involved, he was a trustee for Miami University.
Okay.
And was on the visiting board of West Point. And he and his wife Rachel both started the first subscription school, which is a forerunner of the public school system here in Piqua. So, that was one of his aspects of his life that people many times aren't aware of.
Now, was he part of St. James then? Or?
He was one of the founding members of St. James, yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was also, one of the things he did was, while he was Episcopal, he also brought several different denominations to Piqua, because he also owned a lot of land out here, with the thought that, gee, if I own land, I've got lots of different denomination of churches here, then we've got lots of different people who come here. They need some land. Gee, I own the land.
It all works out nicely.
But a lot of people did that because in those days you had to buy, a lot of times 640 acres. Well, you can't. Most people couldn't afford 640 acres. Once you bought it, then you could subdivide it, just like people do today. So some things don't change a lot.
Well, it's interesting. When I was the pastor at Westminster Presbyterian in Piqua, catty corner to the church, the story that I was always told, and I think it's in our church history book, and you can probably verify this, there was the family that was catty corner was an Episcopal family. And they had paid extra money to the building campaign, to the Caldwell family, because the Caldwell family was part of the backbone of that church, to not have a bell in the Presbyterian tower, because the Episcopalians who were living kind of catty corner across the street didn't want to hear it. Yeah, which I thought was that makes total sense.
Some things don't change, do they?
Yeah.
You still have that. And then actually further down the street, John's one son lived on Cowell.
Okay.
John Henry Dearborn, who was his fourth son. And so he had a tie in the city as well.
So he moved from the country into the city.
He moved into the city because he didn't want to be a farmer.
Okay.
Dad wanted him to be, and he wasn't real pleased with that role. He lived here for a while after John had moved out, and then they moved into town. Actually, his house is right across from Jim Moda's house.
Okay, all right, excellent. See, all these wonderful connections, such a wonderful wealth of...
Well, and another interesting connection too is John and Rachel had 15 children, 10 girls and 5 boys. And one of their daughters, Julia, married a fellow from Dayton by the name of Jefferson Patterson. And they had 2 sons, John and Frank. I kind of joke, I tell people that those 2 boys started a little family business in Dayton that most people have never heard of. They started a National Cash Register. So...
and that Patterson name is very prevalent as well.
The Patterson name is very, especially as you go down, you go down into the Dayton area and you look at everything that the Pattersons touched. UD is on Patterson land. The old what's now the former Montgomery County Fairgrounds was on Patterson land. That homestead was huge down there. So their reach went as far as, in many ways, farther than John's did.
Well, and we have Pattersons out on 66.
You have Pattersons, although I'm not sure that it's the same family, because Jefferson's father, Robert, came up out of Kentucky and he had founded Lexington, Kentucky. He'd been involved with Cincinnati and also Dayton, so they were a Southern family. Whether they're tied into the Piqua Pattersons, because if you go into the Johnston Cemetery, there's all kinds of Pattersons over there, but they're not really the Dayton Pattersons.
The Dayton Pattersons. So, well, interesting connections. So,
but this room gives people an idea, what a family in those days, how this family would have lived, which is obviously, not a one-story log cabin with a dirt floor. So that's what people are struck with is, wow, this is a pretty fancy house for that time. But then they go back to, there's no electricity, there's not much heat.
Well, and 15 children.
And 15 kids. Now, there was the first child was born. John and Rachel went to Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1802. The first child was born in 1803, 1804, and then it goes into 1830. So it was spread out over a good many years.
But they also had people who stayed the night here. It's like, so they had a lot of people in this house.
There was a lot of people in the house and a lot of that goes back to his wife Rachel's background, because she was Quaker. And so, the Quaker hospitality, you can see that going through. And I think too, she had a huge impact on John and the way he looked at his dealing with the native culture, because of the English that lived on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. The native populations had a greater affinity to the Quakers than any other group. And so I think she tempered John's outlook on, and he became very respectful, knowledgeable, and accepting of native culture, which a lot of our ancestors, unfortunately, were not. And it paid dividends, because both sides would listen to John. He could, kind of like the old, I use it, and unfortunately people don't realize this anymore because they're not old enough, the old E.F. Hutton commercial. When E.F. Hutton talks,
people listen.
Yeah. That was John Johnston.
Oh, wow. Excellent. Well, let's travel a little more through the house.
And actually, when the house was built, it was kind of built in two sections. The original plan, and you notice we're walking up through, and there's a very thick wall there. This was to be the original home, and the original plans called for an elevated porch, for this to be the front end, and this was to be the front door. And I think as that was happening, I envision, I don't know this to be a fact, but I kind of envision John and Rachel standing outside watching the house come up out of the ground, and I can see her probably holding a little one and pregnant with another one and looking at John and saying, John, this house ain't big enough.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at this table. I don't know if this table was big enough for 15.
So, the south wing where we started was added on as the house was being built to accommodate. Now, obviously this is the dining room, and a lot of people are surprised when they look at this table, how fancy it is. The silver, the glasses, Wedgwood china, but again, that was what they were used to. John's wife Rachel was from upper middle class Philadelphia, so this would not have been unusual for her. And we know that Johnston had Wedgwood china because when the house was initially restored, they found shards of china that are almost identical to this pattern.
Wow.
So, this would have not been unusual. John was a farmer. People, sometimes don't think about that too. He had about 250 acres of land here. Where the city water plant was Johnston property. And I've got the deed for that piece of property.
Oh, wow.
The original deed, not the...
Yeah, not the current, not the current one.
Current deed.
Well, you think about it. I mean, I'm looking at all of this, and obviously these are replicas of what they had, but with the china and everything, but thinking about what they had to move out here and how they managed to...
Yeah, and see, that's what we don't know, because he and Rachel went to Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was their first post in the West when they worked in the Indian Agency out there. So they wouldn't have brought a lot with them. And so, through time, then they accumulated, the furniture. Now, the furniture that you see here did not belong to the family, but it's from that period. So
it's definitely that period.
That would be very much like what would have been here. We have some pieces of that the Johnstons actually had. Supposedly, the andirons in the fireplace there are Johnston pieces.
Okay.
Some dishes. Some items in this corner cupboard are Johnston pieces. So, we have some things that the family touched. We've got some books and some things like that we know that belong to the family. And it's interesting to be able to look at that and think, what all is associated with that. So, when you put all this together, you see this guy was a little bit of everything to Western Ohio.
It's pretty amazing just the how eclectic he really was.
Yeah, and it's interesting, while he and his wife stressed education with both their sons and their daughters both, we don't know much about John's education. He came to this country alone, basically with a Catholic priest probably, because the rest of his family, his mother, father, and brothers and sister, were still in Europe. But he came over here by himself, and for a long time, why would he do that? And then it finally hit me. He was the youngest of the family. He would have gotten no inheritance. He had to make his own way. So he came to America, started in Pennsylvania, finally ended up over here, and made his way. And ultimately, the rest of his family came over here, and he supported the rest of the family. His mom, after his father passed, and his brothers and sister all lived around here, and John had a hand in their existence.
Wow.
So
and how old was he?
Made good.
Yeah, how old was he when he came to this?
He was 10, 11 years old.
When he came to the States?
When he crossed the Atlantic Ocean.
By himself?
Accompanied with, as I said, with a Catholic priest.
Wow. Wow.
And it's interesting too, he was born in 1775. And he died in 1861 in Washington, D.C. And when I hadn't been here very long, and I was reading some of his letters, and I found a copy of the letter that he had written. He said, well, and this is an older man. He's saying, well, I was born on the eve of the birth of America. I fear I'm going to die on the eve of its death. You kind of think about that. Wow, at that point, because he foresaw what was going to happen, and he was right.
Mm-hmm. Wow, 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 wow. So this is interesting. So I'm looking at the fact that we have their bedroom, right?
We have their bedroom here, and one of the things that we try to do is to talk about, how did the family live? What did they, and how some of the things that we kind of take for granted today, where did they come from? We've all told our kids, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a rope bed, you have to keep your ropes tight, because if you don't, your mattress sags, and you wake up with a bad back. And you think about the mattresses, and this is just an example of a straw tick mattress.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And when they filled the mattress with straw at this time of year, whatever's in the straw comes in, so you've got bed bugs in your mattress. So you don't let the bed bugs bite.
And you don't really have a choice whether you want a firm or a soft mattress. There's only one option.
Now we do know John's mother, Elizabeth, we've got a letter where she ordered 20 pounds of feathers. 20 pounds of feathers is about the amount of feathers it would take to make a feather mattress.
Wow.
So in some cases you see the feather mattress being put on top of the straw tick mattress. And we've got a couple, we've acquired a couple feather mattresses here not too long ago. We'll be changing, we would be changing over, if we were doing winter tours here, we'd be changing over this bedroom because the canopy bed in the wintertime wouldn't have the cheesecloth on it. It would have heavy blankets for warmth. This time of year in the summer, you have that to keep the bugs out if you open your windows. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of the things, you know, we take for granted today.
They didn't have screens back then.
They didn't have screens back then, and you know, this time of year you had 7 fireplaces.
Well, I see the bed warmer.
Yeah, you see the bed warmer there. See the actual full-size bed wrench.
Yeah.
We know that every day one of the chores of all the boys was to make sure you had enough firewood for 7 fireplaces.
Wow, that's why they had 15 kids.
And then all of the girls had their job was to empty the chamber pots every day. So you know, you had division of labor. I don't know who got the better end of that deal, but
oh wow.
And you sort of see, you know, what, you know, a setup that would have likely been in this room for morning getting, you know, because you didn't have your bathroom to go to because you had, you know, you had a path out back.
You had the outhouse.
You had the outhouse, and that's one of the things and people kind of cringe, but I'd love to find their outhouse because if you could, you find what they threw away.
Oh.
So, you know, the urban archaeology is really neat if you can find an outhouse. So far, we haven't found the outhouse.
It's kind of like following scat, that animals you can see kind of where they've been and what they've done. So, yeah, excellent. One of the things I wanted to point out to our viewers as we are out here in this part of our community, the Buckeye Trail, which actually is a loop trail around the state of Ohio, it's 1,444 miles long. It actually comes right in over here off of 66. It comes around the front on the highway here in front of the farm, not this tree line, but the next.
Yeah, right up, if you see the gravel parking lot back about 1/4 of the way down, the trail backs into the tree line. And then it goes down and follows the heel path of the canal and goes on up toward Lockington. And it's interesting in the summer especially, we'll get some hikers through and I'm never know who's more surprised, people on the canal boat or hikers when they see when they see the boat coming at them or they see hikers coming at them. So we do get folks coming through here, and then like you were saying too, this is an extension of the North Country Trail that starts in the Dakotas and goes clear to the East Coast,
which is the longest trail in the country. So
you know, not only do we have the bike path in town, we've also got this great hiking path through.
And I will say, I will encourage those who are viewing today that if you have not been on the Buckeye Trail, and especially this section out here near Johnston Farm, it's a great couple-hour walk. It's a beautiful walk, especially in the fall with the leaves, or in the spring with the trillium and different things that are kind of bursting from the ground. But it's another wonderful amenity that we have here in the city of Piqua.
The thing you need to be careful of in the fall, remember deer season's coming.
That's true, that's true, yes.
And we've never had a hiker shot, but I really hope that doesn't happen. So you've got that, and then the Buckeye Trail goes north. It follows the towpath up north. So yeah, it's a great hike.
Yeah. So just something to point out. All sorts of things you can do out here and enjoy this beautiful space. So great place to take a family on a picnic.
It is. You know, and you know we like to do everything when we do an event. We try to do an event with the idea that it's family friendly. That parents can bring their kids regardless of their ages and not have to worry about, are they safe? Are they going to be exposed to something they shouldn't be? You know, what kind of an environment are they in? So that's the other thing to always keep in mind is what can we do to make this family friendly? Because obviously, you know, the demographic we're looking for are the families. Although we kind of joke that there's 2 times that people come to a place like this, once when they're in the 4th grade and once when they're grandparents. and you know, unfortunately, that's pretty true, pretty true. But yeah, we do like to bring, and we do events, and we see our family, we see families coming out, and that's neat. That's fun to see that happen.
Well, you know, I think about just this place provides a great place for educational fun.
Yeah.
because it's fun and you're also getting an education as well as you're on the canal boat. Or I know that I've been out at Christmas time
Yeah.
for the meals in the farmhouse, and it's very period oriented around that, and the food and just the whole feeling of the evening is just, it's a wonderful way to get the idea of what it would be like to live out here back in during the early 1800s. So, yeah.
Yep.
So, okay, well, we're going to move on to the museum now. I know that one of the highlights for the fourth graders when they come out here is the canal, right on the canal boat. My son, who now is in ninth grade, I remember he talks about it, and I know it was a wonderful highlight of that trip. So we do have this wonderful canal here.
Yeah, and people don't, you see these remnants of it today, and people, I don't know whether they really understand how much the canal contributed, not just to Piqua, but to Ohio. When Ohio became a state in 1803, if you were a farmer like John Johnston, it's the old adage, you couldn't get here from there. We use an example. Johnston in Piqua was lucky to sell a barrel of wheat for $1. But when the canal was completed through Ohio, and he could now ship his goods to Lake Erie and across to New York and down the Erie Canal, he could get $10. So this was the first big growth spurt in Ohio when this canal crossed the state, and we started building canals in 1825. For 20 years, we built nearly 1,000 miles of canals in Ohio.
Wow.
And people at that time never once asked, "Oh golly, can we do this?" They asked the state of Ohio, "How fast can you get this done? You've got to get this finished." Very much like when the interstate highway system started to be constructed. Everybody wanted the freeway to go through their town. Well, people wanted the canal to go through their town too, because this was prosperity, this was business.
It opened them up to the rest of the
world. It did.
Yes.
One of the phrases I like is the canal brought the world to the wilderness.
Oh, yeah.
And Johnston was a part of that. When Ohio began building canals, he was one of the 7 canal commissioners. Of course, then you say, gee, the canal went right past his back door. Go figure. But it was hugely important because it did bring things. And in 1837, this was the northern end of the canal. The canal stopped in Piqua, or actually just north of where we are now. So this was hugely important to the growth of Ohio. And there's a lot of stories. You hear the stories of what happened here on the canal and all the stuff that went on. A couple that we like to relate, or we feel important to relate, is in the summer of 1846 was the Randolph Freedmen coming up from Cincinnati, passed through here, stopped at Johnston's Farm, were able to get off the boat and refresh themselves, keep moving north, and then unfortunately in Mercer County returned back, but came back here. And from what we can gather, is at least some of the groups stayed here on the property for a while and then began to spread out and start their settlements. So that was a story that wasn't one of the more stellar parts of Ohio's history, but we were touched by that right here. And in the fall of 1846, one of the last native groups to leave this part of the country were the Miami Indians. And in the fall of '46, they were loaded in canal boats in Peru, Indiana, came down the Miami-Erie Canal, came right past here around the 6th or 7th of October, and exited out of Ohio to eventually go past to the other side of the Mississippi River. So, those are, some of the more poignant, not so positive parts of the story of the canal, but the canal did bring the prosperity that Ohio needed at that point, because we got great farmland here. But if farmers couldn't get their crops to market, it wasn't any good.
That's true.
And so, we often ask our students is, how would you like to dig a ditch 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 1,000 miles long with a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow? And they generally allow that they would prefer not to do that. But that was how this was built. That's how this system was built. And the canal through Piqua was viable until the fall of 1912. The last canal boat came through Piqua in September of 1912. Then in the spring of 1913 was the flood that pretty much finished off the canal. So, you know, that's the other story we tell here. But again, it goes back to the tide of this. The frontier story, the native story, and the canal story all goes back to this guy, John Johnston.
He's the glue that kind of connects
he
it all.
holds all of this together.
Wow.
And you know, it's unfortunate he's not mentioned much. He was kind of an under the radar sort of guy, sort of behind the scenes many times. And we could talk about all the different things that he did behind the scenes to get, you know, to get a great appreciation of him. But you know, this was a guy that had left his mark.
He really
sure.
did, and our community would not be where it is today if it wasn't for him.
No, it really wouldn't. In fact, if he'd have had his way, now this is being aired in Piqua, right?
Yes.
If he'd have had his way, we'd be the county seat.
Yeah.
Johnston made the statement once that Troy was a nice place to visit, but it was really pretty unhealthy and you got sick there. And his preference was that the county seat be here. And in fact, the first city hall was built on the square with the idea that it would become the courthouse. But the legislature, and I understand why they did it, is they're trying to put the county seats in the center of the county.
Right,
so
right.
It ended up in Troy, much to the chagrin of Johnston and some others. But that's a whole other story for another day.
That's more Piqua Troy history, so yeah.
But then I grew up in a county where they moved the county seat. So, you know, we don't have anything on them over here.
This is a pretty impressive wall here.
It
wall
is.
of history.
When we did this design for the museum originally, this wall was blank, and I said, "Oh, geez, guys, can't we do something with this?" So they said, "Well, what do you want?" I said, "Let's do a Johnston timeline," because, you know, as I said, when I came here, the only thing you ever saw was that he was an Indian agent, and one of the programs I do, I talk about how we identify certain people with just one event in time, and that's not a fair way to look at an individual. One of the examples I use is Woody Hayes. Everybody thinks about Woody Hayes when he hit the kid from Clemson. Well, that's not a whole story of Woody Hayes. You know, so, and that's kind of where we were with John Johnston. So we started to look at all the stuff Johnston did, and when you put all this up, you start to see, my gosh, this guy was involved in everything.
Yeah.
You know, in the middle line, you see his family history. Born in 1775, died in 1861, and you know, for somebody at that time to live to be 85 years old, or 86 years old, that's
amazing.
That really was. A couple of his kids were also, you know, the genes were in the family. You see that several of the kids lived a pretty long time. But then you look at all the stuff that he did politically. You know, you look at the treaties he was involved in, everything there. You start to look at the things that he did there. We talk about mapping roads to Fort Meigs, founding member St. James, Kenyon College. You know, all of this sort of stuff you start to see, and this guy's contributions are huge, and again, not just to Piqua, but to Ohio and to American history as well. So, you know, I hope people start to appreciate and start to grasp the importance of this guy to the history here. You know his contribution. And as I said, when I taught Ohio history and American history, you never read about him. You never read about John Johnston. You don't read those stories. One of them, one of the things, part of his agency, in 1826, there were Indians that were killed in Indiana, which was part of his agency, by whites that had gotten drunked up. John went to Indiana, got them arrested, took to trial, convicted, and executed. It's the first time in American history that our ancestors were held accountable for mistreatment of the native population. You know, so this is a guy that had a lot of backbone to do anything like that. So, you know, I'd love to be able to sit down and talk to him. You know, it's just one of those people that had so much history, and you can still read his history. He wrote for some of the newspapers. He wrote for a couple historians, gave them the information of frontier, because there's nobody in this part of Ohio that experienced more of the Ohio frontier, or the American frontier, than John Johnston. You know, he saw it go from backwoods, you know, to fairly well developed by the time he passed away.
You know, I think about, as you're sharing that story about what he did for the Native American people when he went to their defense, and what William McCulloch has done for African Americans, and both of them part of the history of our community.
Exactly.
Extremely profound.
And a lot of parallels between the two. One of the things that Johnston said when he got wind of what had happened in Indiana, there's a copy of his letter that he was getting ready to write to the War Department, because in those days the Indian agencies were a part of the War Department. They weren't a part of the Department of the Interior. And he was writing this letter, and I can picture him in the house writing. He scratched stuff out. I can picture him stomping around because he was furious with what had happened. And one of the statements he made in the letter, I'm going to have to paraphrase it because I don't remember exactly how he said it, but he told the Secretary of War that if we don't do something honestly and meaningful in dealing with this, with the native population, they'll never have our respect from this time forward. So he knew that we couldn't just give them some money, that we couldn't just say, gosh, you know, we're sorry this happened. We had to do something meaningful, and he accomplished that. And honestly, when he left Indiana, he was lucky to get out of there with his hide. The people over there in Madison County were not happy with him.
Well, he definitely was a great mediator, a great friend, a great person to, you know, kind of equal things, you know.
Exactly.
And what a legacy he's left for our community and for our country as well.
And you know, go back and as I said early on, he got to know William Henry Harrison, and John was very active in presidential politics. He campaigned heavily for Henry Clay. He wanted to see Henry Clay elected president in the worst way. Campaigned for Harrison when he ran for the presidency. And in my mind, I'm pretty well convinced that had Harrison not passed when he did, Johnston likely would have gotten a presidential appointment in Washington. I don't know whether he'd have been a cabinet level position, but I think he would have had, you know, a lot to do with shaping more of American policy and he did anyway. But you know, if he would have been, you know, next to the president, think what could have accomplished. Think how our history could have changed because of John Johnston.
Well, this is great. I really appreciate and there's so much more. I mean, there's so much more, and I know this was kind of an abbreviated version, but
this was a Reader's Digest version of John Johnston.
But I think it's given our viewers some idea of the importance that he has for our community.
Yeah, exactly. And like we said, it's just, and this is just a part of Piqua's history. You know, we've got so much more to tell here. And the more people know about our history, the more people know about the things that happen right here, I think the more positive people will feel about their city, and then that rubs off when visitors come to Piqua and they get that positive vibe instead of the negative Nellies.
Right.
You know, that brings people wanting to come here. So, you know, history is still a viable sort of thing, and you tie that with the growth and the projects that are happening here, and we're in a great place right now. This is a great place to be and a great time to be here.
Well, it really is, and you know, history is so important, and as we look at this history, it also reminds us how important it is to look at our own history. And you know, there's there's a lot of people out there that are doing the 23andMe, you know, looking to see kind of where their ancestors come from. But it's so important to know your story and to know the story of the community where you live, but also your own story as well. So I challenge our viewers today to do a little history walking in your own life to see a little bit about where you come from, and also come out here and do a little walking through history so you can learn a little more about your community and the place where you live. So thank you so much for joining us today for this Eye on Piqua, and I thank Andy
You're
Hite.
quite welcome. Always glad to tell our story here.
Excellent. And I invite you all to come out and join Andy anytime that you can and just continue to learn more about the community where we live.